All right, welcome back, zoologists. So now we are going to work our way through the deuterostomia. So last time we talked about, we introduced the deuterostomes and reviewed those key features, those four key features, and we talked about the hemichordates. So now we're going to start talking about the chordates and the subphyla within. So I'm going to describe the phylum Chordata for you, which we've already kind of reviewed last time, but we're going to go over that briefly again today. We'll talk about the three subphyla that we're going to cover, and then we'll go over each of those subphyla. So the Cephalochordata, the Urochordata, and then the Craniata. So this is the phylogeny I've been showing you all semester long. So we're in the deuterostomes, and we've already covered the Echinodermata and the Hemichordata. Don't forget their sister taxa. So now we're going to go into the Chordata. And just to review, remember all of these phyla are coelomate, so true coelomic cavities. So let's go into the Chordata. So just to recall, this name derives from the fact that they have a support structure that's dorsally located in their bodies called the notochord, or as you're going to see, there's some variations on that notochord theme, going from cartilaginous to completely ossified and bony. But nevertheless, this roughly translates into back chord. And so this is a phylogeny, or sorry, a figure from your book, showing how the ancestors to the deuterostomes dates way back to the Precambrian, so many thousands and millions of years ago. We've already covered the echinoderms and the hemichordates, and so now we're going to see the rest of these taxa the rest of the semester. So today we're going to talk about the Cephalochordata, the lancelets, the Urochordata, the tunicates, and then we'll at least introduce the vertebrates. So just to recall, even though it says hemichordata here, remember what those 5 classic features of chordates are. So the first is the possession of this support structure in the back, so the back chord, otherwise known as a notochord. And initially in some taxa it is fully cartilaginous, but then as we move our way up towards the vertebrates, it's going to become fully ossified and bony and become exceptionally rigid. So in early ancestral forms, it's a solid rod, and it's not until later, when it becomes ossified, that it has these subdivisions called the vertebrae that are interlocking and are, even though they're ossified, the way that they are connected, they have an amazing amount of flexibility in pretty much every direction. So with a cartilaginous rod, you probably have more flexibility in movement with a solid structure, but it's not as supportive as you would get with a fully ossified structure. But when you become fully ossified, you could lose flexibility. It's too rigid. So by virtue of having separate vertebrae that are interlocking, you can actually gain back that flexibility to your back. So the first feature is the presence of a notochord. The second is what's referred to as a dorsal hollow nerve cord, and it's called dorsal because usually it's dorsal to the notochord, so it's above it, if you want to think of it that way. And this nerve cord is, of course, directly connected to your central nervous system. So your brain is anterior, and then this nerve cord goes down your back, not unlike the nerve cords you've seen in other taxa up to now. But it also, of course, has finger projections, so it has neurons and neural connections that go throughout the body. But this is the main nerve center, if you will. And it's showing you in this sort of stereotypical amphioxus or lancelet here. So here it is above, if you want to think of it that way, or dorsal to the notochord. And in humans, here's your brain, and here's your spinal cord, so that's your nerve cord. And in vertebrates, it's completely surrounded by the vertebrae and protected by the vertebrae. You don't actually have that when the notochord is cartilaginous and solid in more ancestral taxa. The third feature are those pharyngeal gill slits or pharyngeal pouches. So in more ancestral taxa, they are used primarily for feeding in coordination with the endostyle. Later on, and here you can see later they are co-opted, and we'll talk about this evolutionary transition, but they're co-opted and modified to be respiratory structures. And you see those respiratory structures, those gill slits, in a variety of aquatic organisms, including sharks and rays and lampreys and hagfishes. And you can actually see the presence of those pharyngeal gill slits in embryology in all taxa, including ourselves. So as embryos, we develop those pharyngeal gill slits, but then they're modified during development, and they're resorbed back, and they're modified into jaw structures. You even see them in birds and reptiles. The fourth character is a post-anal tail. So I think that's kind of a pretty straightforward character. So this is a muscular structure that's used for locomotion or for balance. So you see this in a lot of taxa. And you actually do see remnants of it in humans as well. So the coccyx is the remnant of our tailbones. And then the endostyle is the fifth characteristic. So this is an organ that's used in ancestral taxa in association with the pharyngeal gill slits. So it produces mucus and helps to trap food particles that are passing through those pharyngeal gill slits. And then it helps by ciliary action to transport the food items to the digestive tract. But it becomes modified over time and turns into the thyroid gland, which has huge implications to those animals that have it. So it helps to control the metabolism in humans. It also helps with the immune system as well. Okay, so those are the 5 hallmark features of chordates. So now let's go into the phylum Chordata in a little bit more detail. Now, this is a phylogeny from your book, and believe it, you actually are going to be learning all of these taxa, but let me step you through that, and let's make it a little simpler. We're going to focus at the bottom right down here, and I'm going to show you a simplified phylogeny, but just to orient you, so all of this is the Chordata, and most of these are things that you're probably already familiar with. So we're going to talk about lampreys later on, and you may not know about hagfishes, but they're close relatives. We'll talk about sharks and rays, we'll talk about all kinds of fishes, and then amphibians, and mammals, lizards and snakes, turtles, crocodiles, and birds. So these are all things you're familiar with, so I don't think you'll have too much trouble adding on to the information that you already know. So don't worry about this stuff for yet. Let me show you a simplified diagram. We're going to talk about these guys today, and let's just focus on this right here. So it's just a 3 taxon statement. So this is the Chordata, and let's look at the 3 subphyla within the Chordata: the Cephalochordata, the Urochordata, and then the Vertebrata. So to introduce you to these taxa, if you're not already familiar, so the Cephalochordata, so that term roughly translates into head chordates, okay? So these are one of the first chordates, and it does have a true head, and you'll understand where this term comes from relative to Urochordates when we get to them, because Urochordates are very funky looking. It's hard to believe that they're more closely related to us than the cephalochordates, but that's what all of the latest molecular evidence suggests. So these are often referred to by the common terms Amphioxus or lancelets. And just to be clear, neither of those terms are genera, even though I actually have them italicized here. It's just to set it off from the term above. But they are not genera. So you'll be introduced to other genera of cephalochordates in lab. But they're generically referred to as Amphioxus or lancelets, usually lancelets. The Urochordates are known, that term roughly translates into tail chordates. Sometimes these guys are referred to as tunicates. There are 3 subdivisions within the Urochordata. So the sea squirts, the sea salps, and the larvaceans. And I'll show you some pictures of these. They are very odd sort of creatures. And there's been some interesting hypotheses regarding their evolution and relationship to us that I'll talk to you about here briefly and then more in class. Now, oh, and of course the third subphylum would clearly be the Vertebrata or the Craniata. So traditionally this group has been called the Vertebrata because of the possession of vertebrae. But as you'll see, not all of the taxa have strictly ossified or subdivided vertebrae. But what they do all possess is a cranium, so a solid, rigid structure that protects the brain. So you can think of it as the brain case. And so really the craniata is the more appropriate term for this group, but there are many old school types that are still holding on to the name vertebrata and feel it produces more taxonomic stability to maintain that name rather than to create a new name. Potatoes, patatas. Now, as we discuss these three subphyla, what's really important to keep in mind are those 5 hallmark chordate characters. And what you're going to see is that in each of these subphyla, they're going to differ in terms of if those 5 chordate features are present in the juvenile state versus the adult state. Okay, so that's something I want you to focus on and something I want you to think about in terms of the evolution of these creatures. Okay, so keep in mind the chordate features, and it is also important to note the sister relationships here. So the according to the most recent evidence, the Chordata and vertebrata are sister taxa relative to the Chordata. And that's a relatively new orientation. It used to be that the Chordates and the Chordates, if you switched them in this phylogeny, that's what was thought for decades. It's only recently that scientists have provided evidence to show that, in fact, there's a closer relationship between the Chordates and the vertebrates. So we're going to talk about that. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about each of these, and we're only going to go into these fairly briefly. So again, the Chordata are these sort of fishy-looking creatures called lancelets or amphioxus. They are marine. There's not that many species worldwide. There's approximately 20, and there's 5 genera. They can be found near shore as well as deep sea. They almost all look pretty much like this. There's very few differences between the genera and the species. Some of them are filter feeding. Some of them specialize on feeding on whale carcasses or marine organisms that die and fall to the bottom of the ocean. Oh, sorry, I should have showed you that phylogeny. So as it happens, when they hatch out of their eggs, they actually look very similarly in the juvenile form as they do in the adult form. And so it's a fair question to ask, what chordate characteristics do they possess as larvae, and what do they have as adults? Well, the larvae, so this is a diagram of an adult, but the larvae look incredibly similar to this form. There's very few modifications. And what you can see from this diagram is that they clearly possess a notochord, so this is in purple. So remember, that's the support structure. They have the nerve cord, that's connected to the nervous system. You don't really see much of a brain here, although they do have a small, poorly developed brain. They have the pharyngeal gill slits, which they use for feeding primarily. They have an endostyle, which you really can't see the structure of it here. They're not showing it to you, but it's present there, and it's used for feeding in conjunction with the pharyngeal gill slits. And there's clearly a postanal tail. So in the case of the cephalochordates, they possess all of these features as larvae as well as adults. Okay, so all of them. So now let me introduce you to the Chordata, otherwise known as the tailed chordates. And they include things that look like this, and there's actually quite a bit of variation in them. So these are called tunicates or sea squirts. To me, they almost kind of look like a kind of a funky heart. And these guys are pretty sessile, living on the bottom of the ocean floor. These are sea salps, and there's different species of sea salps. This is a particular species that can exist and does exist in a solitary form, but there's some species that form these colonies that kind of line up side to side, and I'll show you some videos in class. They're really bizarre, and they occur in these really long strings of individuals that are attached together, and sometimes they coil up as you see them here. And some of them look like this, which almost looks like either a funky sperm cell or it looks like an alien from one of those alien movies. So these are referred to as the larvaceans. So sea salps and larvaceans. And here you can see the terms. So sea squirts, sea salps, and larvaceans. So Normally when tunicates or urochordates are introduced in textbooks, this is the classic diagram that you see. And I'm going to walk you through this, and then I'm going to explain what's wrong with this orientation. So this is meant to be an adult sea squirt or tunicate. And so these guys are sessile organisms that are primarily marine. They live on the bottom of the ocean floor, and they're filter feeders. And so here's the in-current siphon, so they draw water in. This is not unlike things that you've seen previously, like sponges, really, for that matter. They draw water in. These are the pharyngeal gill slits, and the endostyle is actually along the edge here. They're filter feeding this food through. The water actually will go through these gills, and it'll exit the excurrent siphon. You can see the rest of the gut here. And what I'm trying to point out in this diagram is those hallmark chordate features that you see in the adult form. So the nerve cord, the nervous system is extremely reduced. So it's almost barely there. It's almost barely gone, I guess I should say. There's just a bare little remnant. It's just enough to power the heart and a few of the remaining muscular structures that it has. It clearly has the pharyngeal gill slits and the endostyle, but it's lost the notochord and it's lost the postanal tail. So these are the three features it retains, and it's lost the tail and it's lost the notochord as an adult. Now, so I point that out here. So the larval form, which I think I have a figure of, I'll show you in just a minute, I guess. The larval form show all of the classic chordate features. And I'm going to show this to you in a minute. This is part of the reason why they show you this diagram here for this particular sort of organism. But hold that thought for a second. Something else you should know about these guys, they had really weird circulatory patterns. So normally with all those organisms that have a circulatory system and a heart, and you've seen a lot of that up to now, even though the hearts have been very simplified, normally blood goes through, or the circulatory system goes one way. So the heart's pumping, and circulatory fluid goes out to the body, and then back to the heart, and out to the body, and back to the heart. And you may find that it goes out to respiratory structures, back to the heart, and it did that to pick up oxygen. And then once that oxygenated blood goes to the heart, then it goes out, to the body, and then comes back around. In these guys, sometimes their heart changes direction. So it'll be pumping, and it'll go this direction for a while, and then suddenly it'll start going in the reverse direction for a while. It's unclear why that happens, or if there's an impact to that, if there's a reason it's doing that, or if it's just able to go back the other way and it's okay. Unclear what's happening there. They're not showing you in this diagram, but just to be clear, because we're always talking about, or we have been talking about the excretory system, the digestive system, and the nervous system, or at least those are some of the foci in this class. So it does have a nephridium, so it's a very close approximation to what we have for a kidney, and it's near the intestine, but you really can't see it in any of its glory in this figure, and there aren't any good figures in your books to show you this, or in other textbooks. So you have to take my word for it. And as I've already mentioned, the nervous system is reduced to this one small nerve ganglion. These guys, by the way, are hermaphroditic, which is kind of interesting. They cannot self, and you can see the gonads here. It's pointing out the ovaries and the testes. So they usually release these into the water column, and they're fertilized there. And they cannot self. They have to fertilize another individual's eggs. Okay, now this is a diagram that's representative of the larval form of these sea squirts. And a lot of textbooks will describe these as looking like a tadpole. And I suppose, roughly speaking, it does. So you can clearly see the nerve cord here on the dorsal portion of it. Here's the notochord, so the support structure. You got a postanal tail. These are the pharyngeal gill slits. And they're showing you the heart. You can't see the endostyle. It actually is kind of drawn in blue here at the edge, but it's very hard to see. So these are free swimming larvae. They swim anywhere that they want to go, and they do this slightly after hatching, and they do this to go around. They filter feed, but they're swimming around trying to find food particles to consume. So as juveniles, they have all 5 of the classic chordate features, But what happens is, and this is supposed to be actually the incurrent, so it looks like this is the mouth, but it's not really, it's kind of a sucker. So this is the mouth, the incurrent siphon, and this is the excurrent siphon. And if you try, you can actually see how what happens is, as they develop over time and they're ready to settle out as adults, they sit down on this portion of the body. That's what you're seeing here. And there's a little bit of a rotation of these two siphons upwards, and the tail just gets reabsorbed. So you just have the siphon sort of orienting up, and then that's how you get this adult form. And so this was developmental biology that was sorted out over 100 years ago. And when scientists saw this, they thought, oh, well, you know, these guys must be the missing link to the vertebrates, right? It's just that what happened is there was a pedomorphic event that occurred that led populations of these guys to remain free swimming, and then other populations developed these adult forms, right? And this adult form was lost in certain populations. So to explain this term pedomorphosis, and I should put this on the slides here, but I'll show you in class. Pedomorphosis is a particular condition whereby you have individuals that retain juvenile characteristics, but they become reproductive. So it would be like if a tadpole never metamorphosed into a frog. It stayed a tadpole, but it became able to reproduce as a tadpole. And so it never got any older. This is actually a condition and a situation that has occurred in lots of different taxa, and we're going to see these when we get to the vertebrates. It's happened in amphibians in several cases. There are salamanders that have undergone this. There are some frogs that have undergone this. Lots of different organisms have done this. And so for a long time, what was thought to have occurred was that maybe there were certain populations of these guys that became pedomorphic, so they retained this juvenile sort of set of features but became reproductive. And when they did, the ancestor of these guys may have given rise to the vertebrates. That was referred to as Garstang's hypothesis, and it lost traction several years ago when, and let me back up these slides for a moment. Oops. It lost traction when it became realized what the relationships are between these three groups, so between the tunicates, the sea salps, and the larvaceans. It turns out that tunicates are very abundant in the oceans, and so it was believed that because they were abundant, they must be the most common form representative of the entire subphylum of all the urochordates. But these urochordates don't have the same sort of life cycle that these guys do. So they don't have these juvenile forms that have all these this loss of all the characters as adults. Now these guys are completely modified. But these guys are actually not the primitive form. They're actually the more derived form. So there no longer seems to be any support for Garstang's hypothesis in its usual sense. So scientists are still trying to understand exactly how these taxa are related to the vertebrates. But you can see where the hypothesis comes from. You can see where it would make sense that if they had become pedomorphic, that might have given rise to the vertebrate taxa that we see today. Oh, I'll show you some videos of sea salps in class next week. Oh, this is to show you the full developmental sequence that they show you in your textbook and how they orient. So here's the juvenile form. It's starting to settle down and absorb its tail. It's losing its notochord. So yeah, its notochord and its nerve cord as well. And then slowly but surely it kind of moves its siphons northwards, if you will, or up. And then here's where you get the full adult sea squirt anyway. Okay, so we've already gone over this. Oh, and I'm also asking, do all urochordates look alike as adults? And clearly they don't. They're very dissimilar. There's quite a lot of diversity within the Urochordata. Okay, and then the last subphylum is the Vertebrata. So here are some classic sort of skulls from different sorts of vertebrate taxa. So we're looking at aquatic species, sort of dolphin-y looking species, and then carnivores, and then this happens to be a favorite of mine since it's one of the chameleon species. And so I already mentioned this. In terms of the more appropriate name for the subphylum, it really should be the Craniata, but your book and in lab, they often still use the Vertebrata. I'll never try to trick you on this. Either term is correct. So if I ask you what's the name of this subphylum, Vertebrata or Craniata is correct. Okay, there seems to be no universal acceptance of one over the other. Okay, so do they have all of the chordate features as adults? Well, sorry, my dad's trying to call me right now and I'm trying to turn the phone off. So they do have all of the features at some point in their life, but they don't necessarily all have them in the usual form as adults. So for instance, they all do have a notochord in their back, but in many of them, and in most of them, it's ossified, and they're subdivided to form those vertebrae in your back. So this just shows you some of them. What's also associated with this, by the way, is a change from a V-shape sort of muscular structure to a W shape. So in some of the ancestral taxa, you have muscles like this that are attached to the notochord, and they form this sort of V shape. But then later on, you get this really much more complicated W shape that gives much more strength to the organism for locomotion and much more flexibility as well. Some other changes that you will see is, oh, sorry, I already said this, the composition of the skeleton is clearly ossified. What you also see in a lot of these taxa is external protection as well, but not in the form of like an exoskeleton. You have the development of thickened skin and structures to help retain water. You also see the development of fur or sometimes scales or feathers on the outside for not only protection for the skin to prevent against injury or abrasion, but it's often also for warmth and for thermoregulation purposes. Oh, and those gill slits, those you're going to see a transformation from using them as feeding structures to using them for respiration among most of the vertebrates. And then that's going to get further modified in some of the really derived vertebrate taxa to form all kinds of structures in the throat. So they're going to be associated with speech and with vocalization. Oh, and this is the simplified, showing you the aortic arches, and then going from pharyngeal gill slits, these are going to get modified into respiratory structures. There are some associated changes to the gut as well. So you're going from ciliary, or from fairly serious ciliary action to really, Jesus, sorry, my phone just went off. It's going to go off really to, going to become more muscular. So there's going to be much more muscular control of food going through the gut. And you're going to see even more than just the addition of these digestive glands, because you've already started to see liver and pancreas, but you're going to see much more regionalization of the gut, both in the small intestine and large intestine, and you'll see other accessory organs. But what's really interesting is as we go through each of the vertebrate groups, you're going to see really interesting specializations within each group to their gut. So for instance, you're going to see modifications of the stomach. You're going to see what's called a spiral valve in the sharks to help increase surface area for digestion and absorption. You're going to see different sizes of the liver. Sometimes the liver is going to be gigantic to deal with, really high fat content. Sometimes it'll be strongly reduced. Anyway, you'll see modifications of the gut. Okay, so we're going to talk more about the vertebrates and go in much more detail next time. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the first ones. So we're going to talk about the agnathans, so hagfish and lampreys. So that's it for this video. See you next time.